The year was 971. Outside the mighty walls of Dorostalon, on the banks of the Danube River, two worlds stood poised for a final confrontation. On one side stood Sviatoslav of Kiev, the fearsome prince of the Rus. His warriors were hardened by countless campaigns. They had crossed rivers, burned cities, and shattered kingdoms. Across Eastern Europe, his name inspired fear. On the other side stood a man who had risen from the ranks of Byzantine generals through courage, skill, and relentless determination. John Tzimiskes. He was not the tallest man. He was not born an emperor, and many believed he had no right to wear the imperial crown at all. Yet within days, he would achieve what few thought possible. He would defeat Sviatoslav. He would save the Byzantine Empire from one of the greatest threats it had faced in generations. And he would launch a revival that would transform Byzantium into the dominant power of the medieval world. But there was a dark irony behind his triumph. John Tzimiskes had become emperor through bloodshed. He had betrayed a ruler who trusted him. His path to greatness began with conspiracy, murder, and ambition. Was he a hero? A usurper? A military genius? Or all three at once? This is the story of John I Tzimiskes, the warrior emperor who defeated Sviatoslav and restored Byzantium. And it begins long before the battle on the Danube. It begins in the rugged frontier lands of Anatolia. John Tzimiskes was born around 925 AD into an Armenian noble family that had long served the Byzantine Empire. The eastern frontier was a harsh place. For centuries, Byzantine soldiers had fought endless wars against Arab armies crossing from Syria and Mesopotamia. Children born there grew up hearing stories of raids, sieges, and heroic last stands. Young John was no exception. From an early age, he learned to ride horses, wield weapons, and endure hardship. Unlike many aristocrats in Constantinople, he understood warfare not as an abstract concept but as a way of life. The frontier forged warriors. And it forged him. Contemporary sources describe him as physically strong, energetic, and charismatic. He possessed a rare gift. Men wanted to follow him. Soldiers trusted him. Commanders respected him. And enemies feared him. These qualities soon attracted the attention of one of Byzantium's greatest military leaders, Nikephoros Phocas. At the time, Nikephoros was already becoming a legend. A brilliant strategist and relentless commander, he led Byzantine armies against Muslim powers across the eastern frontier. John happened to be his nephew. The relationship would change history. Under Nikephoros, John learned the art of war. He studied cavalry tactics. He mastered logistics. He learned how to move armies across difficult terrain. Most importantly, he learned how to win. The Byzantine military was undergoing a transformation. For generations, the empire had struggled merely to survive. Now it was beginning to fight back. And John Tzimiskes was at the forefront of this resurgence. In the 960s, Byzantine fortunes changed dramatically. Nikephoros Phocas launched a series of spectacular campaigns. He captured Crete. He defeated Arab armies. He expanded imperial territory. His victories electrified the empire. For centuries, Byzantium had often been on the defensive. Now it was advancing. John Tzimiskes played an important role in many of these operations. As a cavalry commander, he demonstrated remarkable skill. One famous campaign saw him achieve victory against larger enemy forces through speed and surprise. Again and again he proved his worth. The soldiers admired him. The officers respected him. His reputation spread. When Emperor Romanos II died unexpectedly in 963, a power vacuum emerged. The empire needed strong leadership. The army supported Nikephoros Phocas. Within months, the celebrated general became Emperor Nikephoros II. For John Tzimiskes, the future seemed bright. His uncle sat upon the throne. The empire was expanding. Victory followed victory. But success often creates new rivalries. And soon, the relationship between uncle and nephew began to deteriorate. Power changes people. Some historians believe Nikephoros became increasingly suspicious after becoming emperor. Others argue court politics poisoned the relationship. Whatever the reason, John suddenly found himself marginalized. The man who had helped build Nikephoros' military success was pushed aside. Commands were taken away. Influence disappeared. Opportunities vanished. For an ambitious warrior, it was a devastating blow. Yet while John lost favor with the emperor, he gained an unexpected ally. The empress. The beautiful and intelligent Theophano. Theophano was one of the most controversial women in Byzantine history. Ambitious, politically astute, and determined to secure her position, she became increasingly dissatisfied with her husband. Nikephoros was a brilliant soldier, but he was not an easy ruler. He imposed heavy taxes. He lived almost like a monk. Many people in Constantinople resented him. Opposition grew. Whispers spread. Conspiracies formed. And at the center of one of them stood John Tzimiskes. December 969. The imperial palace lay silent beneath the winter sky. Inside, Emperor Nikephoros slept. He had survived countless battles. He had defeated powerful enemies. He had conquered cities and expanded the empire. But the greatest danger was not outside the walls. It was already inside. Late that night, conspirators entered the palace. Some accounts claim they were smuggled in with assistance from Theophano. Others differ in details. But the outcome is clear. The assassins reached the emperor's chambers. Nikephoros awoke. Too late. The attackers overwhelmed him. Within moments, the warrior emperor was dead. One of the most successful military rulers in Byzantine history had been murdered. And John Tzimiskes stood behind the conspiracy. The throne was suddenly within reach. But gaining power and keeping power were two very different challenges. Many people were shocked by the assassination. The Patriarch of Constantinople condemned the murder. The empire could easily have descended into chaos. John needed legitimacy. To secure his position, he distanced himself from Theophano. The empress was exiled. Publicly, John presented himself as a ruler acting in the interests of the empire. Soon afterward, he was crowned emperor. John I Tzimiskes had achieved the highest office in the Byzantine world. Yet enemies surrounded him. Many questioned his right to rule. And even greater threats waited beyond the empire's borders. One of those threats was already moving south toward the Balkans. Its leader was named Sviatoslav, and he was about to challenge the very survival of Byzantium. When John Tzimiskes seized the Byzantine throne in 969, he inherited more than an empire. He inherited a crisis. Far to the north, beyond the Black Sea and the vast grasslands of Eastern Europe, a warrior prince was building a power unlike anything Byzantium had faced in generations. His name was Sviatoslav. To his followers, he was the embodiment of the perfect warrior. He slept on the ground beside his men. He carried little luxury. He preferred battlefields to palaces. According to chroniclers, he shaved his head except for a single lock of hair and wore simple clothing despite his status. Everything about him projected strength. Everything about him inspired loyalty. And everything about him frightened Byzantium. Sviatoslav had transformed the Kievan Rus into a military powerhouse. Campaign after campaign expanded his influence. He destroyed the Khazar Khaganate, a state that had dominated parts of Eastern Europe for centuries. He crushed rivals. He opened new trade routes. He accumulated wealth, prestige, and warriors eager for more conquest. Success fueled ambition. Soon Sviatoslav began looking south, toward the Balkans, toward the wealthy lands that had once belonged to Rome, toward Byzantium. Ironically, the Byzantines had helped create the danger. Years earlier, Byzantine diplomats had encouraged Sviatoslav to attack Bulgaria, hoping to weaken a troublesome neighbor. The strategy worked. At first, Sviatoslav invaded Bulgaria with devastating effectiveness. Bulgarian resistance collapsed. Cities surrendered. Fortresses fell. The Byzantine government expected him to leave once the fighting ended. Instead, he stayed. And then he wanted more. Much more. Sviatoslav became fascinated by the Balkans. He reportedly dreamed of creating a new empire centered on the Danube. A state that would dominate trade between Europe and Asia. A state that could rival Byzantium itself. The ally had become a threat. a very dangerous threat. When John Tzimiskes took the throne, the situation was alarming. Sviatoslav controlled large portions of Bulgaria. His armies stood dangerously close to Byzantine territory. The empire could not ignore him. Yet John faced difficulties. His rule was still new. Many doubted his legitimacy. He needed time to consolidate power. For the moment, diplomacy bought him breathing room. But everyone understood the truth. Sooner or later, war would come. And when it did, only one side would emerge victorious. John spent the next months preparing carefully. He reorganized the military. He strengthened defenses. He gathered experienced commanders. Most importantly, he ensured that when the campaign began, the Byzantine army would strike with overwhelming force. This was one of John's greatest strengths. Unlike reckless rulers who rushed into battle, he planned meticulously. He understood logistics. He understood timing. And he understood that empires are often won long before the first sword is drawn. By 971, he was ready. The moment had arrived. Spring of 971. The Byzantine army advanced north. Veteran infantry marched beneath imperial banners. Heavy cavalry rode alongside them. Engineers, supply trains, and siege equipment followed. This was not a raid. This was a campaign designed to destroy a rival power. John personally led the expedition. His presence inspired confidence. The soldiers knew their emperor was no palace politician. He was one of them. A commander who understood warfare. A leader willing to share danger. As the Byzantine army crossed into Bulgaria, speed became its greatest weapon. Many strongholds surrendered quickly. Others were overwhelmed. The campaign unfolded with remarkable efficiency. Then came the most important objective. The Bulgarian capital. Preslav was heavily defended. Inside were Bulgarian forces and Rus warriors loyal to Sviatoslav. Capturing the city would be difficult, but John understood its strategic value. Without Preslav, enemy control of Bulgaria would begin to unravel. The Byzantine assault was fierce. Siege engines battered defenses. Infantry pressed forward. Arrows darkened the sky. After intense fighting, the city fell. The victory was enormous. The Bulgarian ruler, Boris II, came into Byzantine hands. John treated him with relative respect. Rather than present himself as Bulgaria's conqueror, John portrayed himself as its liberator from Rus domination. It was clever politics. Military victories alone were never enough. Winning legitimacy mattered too. But despite the fall of Preslav, the war was not over. The most dangerous enemy still remained. Sviatoslav had withdrawn to Dorostelon on the Danube. There, he prepared for a final stand. As news spread, warriors from across the region gathered around Sviatoslav. He knew retreat would destroy his reputation. He knew surrender was unacceptable. The only path left was resistance. The Rus prince reportedly addressed his warriors before battle. According to later accounts, he told them that there was nowhere left to run. They must either win or die. Such words resonated deeply with his followers. These were men accustomed to hardship, men who measured honor through courage, men willing to face impossible odds. John understood exactly what kind of opponent awaited him. This would not be a simple siege. This would be a struggle between two extraordinary leaders. Both were brave. Both were ambitious. Both had built their reputations through victory. Only one would leave Dorostelon triumphant. When the Byzantine army arrived, Dorostelon appeared formidable. Strong walls protected the city. The Danube offered access to supplies. Inside waited thousands of determined warriors. John immediately began tightening the noose. Byzantine forces surrounded the city. At the same time, the imperial navy controlled river access. The objective was clear: isolation, starvation, pressure. Eventually, the defenders would weaken. At least that was the theory. Reality proved more complicated. Sviatoslav refused to remain passive. Again and again, his warriors launched attacks against Byzantine positions. These battles became brutal contests of endurance. Rus infantry fought with ferocious determination. The Byzantines responded with discipline and superior organization. Casualties mounted. Neither side could claim an easy victory. Weeks passed. The siege dragged on. The fate of the Balkans hung in the balance. One battle became particularly famous. The Rus launched a massive sortie against the besieging army. Warriors surged from the city gates. Axes, spears, and swords flashed in the sunlight. The fighting quickly descended into chaos. At first, the Rus' advance threatened Byzantine lines. Their aggression shocked many defenders. But John remained calm. He had spent his entire life mastering battlefield tactics. Now he demonstrated why he was considered one of the greatest commanders of his age. The emperor deployed his cavalry at precisely the right moment. The armored horsemen struck with devastating force. The Rus' assault began to lose momentum. Then the Byzantines counterattacked. The battlefield turned into a slaughter. Bodies covered the ground. The defenders retreated. The city gates closed once more. Sviatoslav had failed to break the siege, yet he still refused to surrender. As the siege continued, supplies inside Darustalon dwindled. Food became scarce. Morale weakened. Disease spread. The pressure was relentless. John knew victory was near, but he also knew desperate enemies could become dangerous. He maintained discipline. He prevented complacency. He continued tightening the blockade. Meanwhile, Byzantine ships ensured that reinforcements and provisions could not reach the city. The trap was closing. Every day made resistance more difficult. Every day brought Sviatoslav closer to defeat. Still, the Rus prince would not yield. His reputation, his dreams, his future, everything depended upon this struggle. And so the siege entered its final stage. The decisive confrontation was approaching. Soon, one of the most famous warrior kings of the medieval world would be forced to make a choice: fight to destruction, or negotiate with the emperor who had outmaneuvered him. The answer would change the course of Eastern European history, and it would elevate John Tzimiskes from a controversial usurper into the savior of Byzantium. But the greatest moment of his reign was still ahead. By the summer of 971, the struggle for Darustalon had become a contest of endurance. 4 months, the warriors of Sviatoslav had resisted everything the Byzantine Empire could throw at them. They had fought in open battle. They had defended the walls. They had launched desperate attacks against the besiegers. Yet despite their courage, the situation was becoming hopeless. Food supplies were nearly exhausted. Casualties continued to rise. Every attempt to break the siege had failed. Outside the city stood one of the finest armies in the medieval world, and at its head stood an emperor who understood exactly how to turn pressure into victory. John Tzimiskes was running out of patience. Sviatoslav was running out of options. The end was near. Before accepting defeat, Sviatoslav made one final attempt. One final gamble. One final battle. The gates of Darustalon opened once more. Thousands of Rus warriors marched out. This was not a simple raid. This was an all-or-nothing assault. If they could break the Byzantine lines, perhaps they could escape. Perhaps they could survive. Perhaps they could continue the war. If they failed, everything would be lost. The fighting that followed was among the bloodiest of the campaign. The Rus attacked with their usual ferocity. Axes crashed into shields. Spears thrust forward. War cries echoed across the battlefield. For a time, the outcome remained uncertain. But John had prepared carefully. His forces maintained formation. His officers controlled the battlefield. Most importantly, his cavalry remained intact. At the critical moment, the armored horsemen charged. The impact shattered the momentum of the Rus attack. What began as a desperate offensive soon became a retreat. The warriors of Sviatoslav fought bravely. But bravery alone could not overcome exhaustion, hunger, and overwhelming pressure. By the end of the day, the Rus had suffered terrible losses. The dream of victory was gone. Only survival remained. Soon afterward, negotiations began. Sviatoslav finally accepted reality. Darustalon could not hold. The campaign was lost. The Byzantine Empire had won. The resulting agreement was surprisingly generous. John could have sought complete destruction. He could have annihilated the remaining Rus forces. Instead, he chose diplomacy. The surviving warriors would be allowed to leave. In return, Sviatoslav would abandon his ambitions in the Balkans. The Rus would withdraw. The immediate threat to Byzantium would disappear. For John, this outcome was ideal. He had achieved his objective without unnecessary risk. He had removed a dangerous rival. And he had demonstrated that he possessed not only military skill but political wisdom as well. The war was over, but history would forever remember the remarkable encounter that followed. Byzantine chroniclers preserved a fascinating account of the meeting between John Tzimiskes and Sviatoslav. Whether every detail is accurate is impossible to know. Yet the story captures the contrast between the two men. John arrived in imperial splendor. He wore magnificent armor. He rode a richly adorned horse. He was surrounded by elite guards. Everything reflected the power and prestige of the Byzantine Empire. Sviatoslav appeared very different. He reportedly arrived by boat. He dressed simply. He looked more like an ordinary warrior than a ruler, yet his confidence remained unmistakable. The contrast was striking. One represented the wealth and sophistication of an ancient empire. The other embodied the rugged martial culture of the northern frontier. Both commanded respect. Both had shaped history. Yet only one had emerged victorious. The meeting symbolized a turning point. The age of Rus expansion into the Balkans had ended. The Byzantine Empire had regained control. And John Tzimiskes had secured his place among the great emperors of the medieval world. The victory over Sviatoslav transformed the strategic situation. For years, the Balkans had been unstable. Now the empire once again held the initiative. Bulgaria fell under Byzantine influence. The Danube frontier became more secure. Constantinople could finally focus on opportunities elsewhere. For John, the triumph offered something even more valuable: legitimacy. Many had viewed him as a usurper, a man who gained power through assassination. But military success changes perceptions. Victorious rulers are often judged differently from defeated ones. The emperor who had once faced suspicion now enjoyed prestige. The army admired him. The population celebrated him. The empire appeared stronger than it had in decades. Yet John had no intention of stopping. He had defeated Sviatoslav. Now he looked east, toward lands that had challenged Byzantium for centuries, toward Syria, toward Palestine, toward the heart of the Middle East. The eastern frontier had always been one of Byzantium's greatest concerns. For generations, Arab powers had threatened imperial territory. Although earlier emperors had achieved important victories, much work remained. John intended to continue the advance. Beginning in the early 970s, Byzantine armies launched new offensives. City after city fell. Fortresses surrendered. Enemy resistance crumbled. The campaigns demonstrated the full maturity of the Byzantine military revival. This was no longer the struggling empire of earlier centuries. This was a confident and aggressive power, one capable of projecting force across vast distances. John personally directed many operations. His leadership inspired confidence. His strategic vision produced results. The empire expanded deeper into Syria. Ancient cities returned to Byzantine control. Territories lost generations earlier were recovered. Every victory enhanced the emperor's reputation. Every success strengthened the state. The restoration of Byzantium was becoming a reality. One of the most remarkable moments of John's reign came during his southern advance. Byzantine armies pushed toward Palestine. For many contemporaries, this seemed extraordinary. Few would have imagined such progress only decades earlier. The empire that had once fought desperately for survival was now advancing into lands associated with biblical history. The symbolism was powerful. John understood this. Military victories inspired confidence. Religious prestige enhanced authority. Together they created a potent combination. Although he did not permanently reconquer all the territories he entered, the campaigns demonstrated Byzantine strength to allies and enemies alike. The empire had returned as a major force in the Near East. And much of that achievement belonged to John Tzimiskes. Then, at the height of his success, everything changed. In 976, John prepared to return to Constantinople after another successful campaign. He was only about 50 years old. His empire was stronger. His enemies were weaker. His future appeared bright. Then he suddenly fell ill. The emperor's condition deteriorated rapidly. Within days, he was dead. The timing shocked the empire. How could a vigorous military ruler die so unexpectedly? Rumors spread almost immediately. Some suspected illness. Others suspected poison. One story accused powerful officials who feared losing influence. Another suggested court intrigue. The truth remains uncertain. Centuries later, historians still debate what happened. What is clear is that Byzantium lost one of its most capable rulers at the very moment of his greatest success. His reign had lasted only a few years, yet its impact would endure for generations. After John's death, the throne passed to the young Basil II. At the time, few could have predicted that Basil would become one of the greatest emperors in Byzantine history. But Basil inherited advantages that did not appear by accident. He inherited secure frontiers. He inherited a revitalized military. He inherited an empire strengthened by years of successful warfare. Much of that foundation had been built by John Tzimiskes. Without the victory over Sviatoslav, the Balkans might have remained unstable. Without the eastern campaigns, Byzantine influence would have been weaker. Without John's leadership, Basil's future achievements might have been impossible. The warrior emperor had prepared the way. Others would build upon his success. History often remembers the longest reigns, the largest empires, the most famous names. Yet sometimes the individuals who change the course of history rule for only a brief moment. John I Tzimiskes was one of those men. He came to power through conspiracy. He seized a throne stained with blood. Many doubted him. Many distrusted him. But when the empire needed a soldier, it found one. When Byzantium faced the threat of Sviatoslav, he defeated him. When enemies challenged the empire in the east, he pushed them back. When the future of Byzantium seemed uncertain, he restored its confidence and its strength. His reign lasted only 6 years. Yet those 6 years altered the destiny of an empire. And perhaps that is why John Tzimiskes remains such a fascinating figure. Not because he was perfect, not because he was innocent, but because he possessed the rare ability to reshape history through force of will, military genius, and relentless determination. The empire he strengthened would soon enter one of the most glorious periods in its existence. A new emperor was waiting, a ruler who would become known as the Bulgar Slayer, a monarch who would elevate Byzantium to heights unseen for centuries. His name was Basil II, and his story was about to begin.